My name is Klaus Weber. I'm 83 years old, and on November 15th, 1947, I died for 12 minutes. I was a former Wehrmacht officer beaten to death by Holocaust survivors who recognized me. What happened next changed everything I believed about God, forgiveness, and redemption. Before I tell you about meeting Christ, you need to know the monster I was. You need to understand the depths from which I was pulled, because without that knowledge, my story means nothing. I was not some innocent man who simply found himself on the wrong side of history. I was a willing participant in evil, and I need you to know that truth. I was 17 years old when I joined the Wehrmacht in 1942. My father was a dedicated party member who had filled my head with propaganda since I could barely walk. In our house, Hitler's portrait hung next to my grandmother's crucifix, and somehow we saw no contradiction in that placement. My father would read me passages from Mein Kampf, the way other fathers read bedtime stories. He told me we were the chosen people, destined to save not just Germany, but all of civilization from the corrupting influences that threatened our pure Aryan blood. When I put on that uniform for the first time, I felt pride swelling in my chest. The grey wool felt heavy with purpose, and I believed I was answering a sacred calling. They told us we were saving Germany, saving civilization itself from the Bolshevik menace and the Jewish conspiracy that sought to destroy everything good and pure in this world. I absorbed these lies like a sponge absorbs water, never questioning, never doubting, never thinking for myself. My unit was first stationed in Poland, then later moved to occupied territories in Ukraine. I remember the train ride to our first posting. We sang marching songs and shared stories about the glorious battles we would fight. We were young men filled with righteous fury, convinced we were soldiers of light, battling the forces of darkness. How naive we were, how absolutely, tragically naive. The first time I witnessed an execution, I vomited for hours afterward. It was a small village outside Krakow, and we had received intelligence that partisans were hiding among the civilian population. My commanding officer lined up 12 men against a stone wall. I can still see their faces, the way their eyes darted between us and their families who watched from behind our cordon. One man, barely older than myself, kept looking at a young woman holding a baby. I realized it must be his wife and child. I stood at attention as the order was given, watching as 12 lives ended in seconds. The sound of the rifles echoed off the surrounding buildings, and I watched 12 men crumple to the ground, like marionettes with cut strings. Afterward, I ran behind the building and emptied my stomach until nothing came up but bile. My sergeant found me there and slapped me across the face. He told me I was weak, that these people were enemies of the Reich, that their deaths would save German lives. But orders were orders, and questioning those orders meant death. That lesson was made clear when a soldier in another company expressed doubts about our mission. He was shot for insubordination and cowardice in the face of the enemy. We were all forced to watch as his body was left where it fell, a reminder of what happened to those who lacked the stomach for cancer-rich necessary work. Slowly, terribly slowly, I stopped seeing them as people. It happened gradually, like a slow poison working through my system. The officers explained that what looked like cruelty was actually mercy. They told us we were preventing a greater suffering, that by eliminating these threats now, we were saving countless German children from future harm. I convinced myself they were enemies, active threats to the fatherland and everything I held dear. Each act of cruelty became easier than the last. The first time I participated in a roundup, my hands shook as I herded families toward the transport trucks. By the 10th time, my hands were steady. By the 20th, I felt nothing at all. I had become a machine designed for one purpose, and I performed that purpose with mechanical efficiency. I was present during deportations in occupied Ukraine, standing guard as entire communities were loaded onto cattle cars. I followed orders that separated families forever, watching as children were torn from their parents' arms and loaded onto different transports. I told myself this was necessary, that these separations were temporary, that they would be reunited once they reached their destinations. I knew these were lies, even as I told them to myself, but lies were easier to live with than truth. I watched children cry for parents who would never return. Their faces haunt me still. Little hands pressed against train car windows, voices calling for mothers and fathers who stood helpless behind our rifles. One little girl, she couldn't have been more than 5 years old, kept asking me where her mama was going. I told her mama would see her soon, knowing full well that soon meant never. The worst part was how normal it all became. We would finish our work for the day, then return to our barracks to play cards and write letters home. We told ourselves we were doing difficult but necessary work for the greater good. We convinced ourselves that our victims were not truly innocent, that they posed some vague but existential threat to our way of life. When Germany surrendered in 1945, I couldn't face going home. How could I look my mother in the eye and tell her what her son had become? How could I sit at our kitchen table and pretend to be the boy who had left 2 years earlier? That boy was dead, killed by the man I had chosen to become. My own mother turned away when she finally learned what I had done. A neighbor had recognized my name in a list of war criminals being sought by the Allies. When I appeared at her door, she looked at me as if I were a stranger. She told me I was no longer her son, that the Klaus she had raised would never have done such things. She closed the door in my face, and I never saw her again. I became a ghost, moving from camp to camp, city to city, always looking over my shoulder, always afraid of recognition. I worked odd jobs under false names, sleeping in bombed-out buildings and abandoned factories. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the weight I carried in my chest, a crushing burden that grew heavier with each passing day. Ask yourself this question, if you can bear to consider it. Can a man who has done such things ever truly be forgiven? Can someone who willingly participated in the destruction of innocence ever find peace? I lived with these questions for 2 years after the war, and I was no closer to answers when November 15th, 1947 arrived. November 15th, 1947 started like any other day in my miserable existence. I was outside Munich in a displaced persons camp, one of dozens that had sprouted across Germany like mushrooms after rain. The camp housed hundreds of Holocaust survivors, people who had lost everything and were trying to rebuild their lives from nothing. I was working odd jobs there, trying to survive on whatever scraps of work I could find, always keeping my head down, always trying to remain invisible. The irony was not lost on me that I was living among the very people I had helped persecute. Every day I walked past survivors, hearing fragments of conversations in Yiddish, Polish, and Hungarian. I saw the numbers tattooed on their arms, the hollow look that never quite left their eyes, the way they moved through the world like people who had learned not to expect kindness from it. I was surrounded by living reminders of what I had done, and part of me believed this was exactly the hell I deserved. I had been loading supply trucks that morning, earning enough marks for a meal and a place to sleep. The work was backbreaking, but I welcomed the physical exhaustion. It was the only time my mind could find any peace, when my body was so tired that even my guilt felt distant. I was stacking crates of medical supplies when I heard a woman's voice behind me, speaking in heavily accented German. "You," she said, and something in her tone made me freeze. "Turn around." I turned slowly and found myself looking into the face of a woman perhaps 40 years old, though she looked much older. Her hair was prematurely grey, her face marked by lines that spoke of suffering beyond imagining. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. They were eyes that had seen too much, survived too much, and they were staring at me with growing recognition. "I know you," she whispered, and I watched the color drain from her face. "Krakow, the ghetto. You were there." My mouth went dry. I wanted to deny it, to claim she was mistaken, but the words died in my throat. How could I lie to this woman who had survived what I had helped create? How could I add insult to the injuries I had already caused? "You helped load the trains," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "You separated the children from their parents. You told us we were being relocated for work. Other people began to notice our conversation. A small crowd started to gather, drawn by the tension in the woman's voice. I recognized that look in their eyes, the same look prey animals get when they realize they are cornered. Except in this case, I was not the hunter. I was the one who had been found. "Sarah Goldstein," the woman said, pointing to herself. "Do you remember that name? Do you remember my children, David and Rachel? You put them on a different train. You told me I would see them in a few days." I did remember her. The memory hit me like a physical blow. Sarah Goldstein, standing on the platform with her two small children clinging to her skirt. I remembered how she had begged to stay with them, how I had forced her onto one train while her children were loaded onto another. I remembered the sound she made when the train's doors closed, a sound no human being should ever have to make. "I remember," I said quietly. The crowd around us had grown larger, and I could hear murmurs of recognition from others. Someone shouted something in Polish. Another voice responded in Hungarian. The language barriers meant nothing. The tone of rising anger was universal. I saw hands clenching into fists, saw the way people were positioning themselves around me. "He was there," Sarah called out to the growing crowd. "This man was at Krakow. He helped them separate families. He helped load the trains." That was when the dam burst. They came at me with fists, sticks, stones, anything they could find, as weapons. But here is what you need to understand. I didn't fight back. How could I? They had every right to their rage. Every right to seek justice for what had been done to them and their families. I had spent 2 years running from my past, but the past had finally caught up with me. I thought about running, considered pushing through the crowd and trying to escape, but where could a man like me hide? What was the point of prolonging the inevitable? So I had been living as a ghost for 2 years, and perhaps it was time for that ghost to finally be laid to rest. The first blow came from Sarah herself. her fist connecting with my nose. I heard the cartilage snap and felt the blood begin streaming down my face. The pain was sharp and immediate, but somehow clean. It was the first honest pain I had felt in years, pain that I had earned, pain that served a purpose. More blows followed quickly. A man I didn't recognize swung a wooden plank at my chest, and I felt my ribs crack under the impact. The breath rushed out of my lungs in a whoosh, and I staggered backward, only to find more hands reaching for me. Another man, elderly but still strong, grabbed the stone and struck me in the temple. Stars exploded across my vision, and I felt my legs give way beneath me. I collapsed in the mud, tasting blood and dirt mixing in my mouth. My left arm was bent at an impossible angle, the bone having snapped when I tried to break my fall. The pain was extraordinary, but beneath it was something else, something I had not expected: relief. For the first time in 2 years, I was receiving exactly what I deserved. The crowd pressed closer, and I could hear their voices raised in languages I understood and others I didn't. But the emotion behind those voices was crystal clear: rage, pain, the desperate need for someone to pay for what had been taken from them. I was that someone. I was the face they could finally put their hands on, the representative of a system that had destroyed their lives. Someone kicked me in the ribs, and I heard more bones crack. Another person struck my skull with what felt like a metal pipe, and the world began to tilt sideways. My vision started to narrow, the edges going dark, while the center remained stubbornly bright. I tried to speak, to say something that might matter, but my mouth was full of blood. Finally, I managed to whisper the only words that seemed appropriate. "I'm sorry." I don't know if anyone heard me over the shouting, and I don't know if it would have mattered if they had. The shouting around me began to fade, though I could still see mouths moving, still see the fury in their eyes. The world was becoming distant, as if I were watching it through thick glass. My chest felt like it was being crushed under an enormous weight, and each breath became a struggle. Then the light began to narrow to a pinpoint, and I felt something strange happening. It was as if I were being pulled upward, away from my broken body, lying in the mud. The last thing I remember thinking before everything went dark was that this was probably exactly how it was supposed to end for someone like me. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself this question: what would you have done in their place if you had lost everything, everyone you loved, to people like me, and then found one of those people living among you? What would your reaction have been? I cannot blame them for what they did to me that day. I can only say that justice, when it finally comes, feels different than you expect it to feel, than darkness, complete, absolute darkness unlike anything I had ever experienced. But strangely, I was still aware, still thinking, still existing in some form I could not understand. The pain from my broken body was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling. The realization that I was no longer connected to the physical world, yet somehow still conscious. I found myself floating above the scene in the displaced persons camp, looking down at my own broken body lying motionless in the mud. It was the most bizarre sensation imaginable, seeing myself from this impossible perspective. My face was barely recognizable, swollen and bloody, my left arm twisted at a grotesque angle. The crowd had stepped back, and I could see Sarah kneeling beside my body, pressing her fingers to my neck, searching for a pulse. "He's gone," I heard her say. though her voice seemed to come from very far away. There's no pulse. Strange thing was, I felt no pain watching this scene unfold. The agony that had consumed my final moments was completely absent. Instead, I felt a deep, hollow emptiness, like standing in a vast cathedral where even whispers echo endlessly. I tried to call out to Sarah to tell her I could see her, that I was somehow still there, but I had no voice, no body with which to speak. Other survivors had gathered around my corpse, and I could hear fragments of their conversation. Some expressed satisfaction that justice had finally found one of their tormentors. Others seemed troubled by what had happened, perhaps wondering if this violence made them no better than those who had brutalized them. I wanted to tell them they were nothing like us, that their anger was righteous while ours had been poisonous, but the words existed only in my consciousness. Suddenly I felt myself being pulled away from that scene, drawn into what seemed like a tunnel. But this wasn't the bright tunnel of light that people often describe in near-death experiences. This was darkness so thick it seemed to have physical substance, the winds pressing against my consciousness from all directions. The darkness had weight, density, and it felt malevolent in ways I struggled to describe. As I moved through this oppressive void, I became aware that I was not alone. Shapes moved in the darkness around me, shadows within shadows that seemed to whisper accusations. I could not see them clearly, but I could feel their presence, and something told me they were connected to my past, to the choices I had made during the war. Then they appeared. The faces I thought I had forgotten, emerging from the darkness, like photographs developing in chemical solution. First was Miriam Rosenbaum, a young mother from the Krakow ghetto. I remembered her clearly now. Remembered how she had begged me not to separate her from her 3-year-old son as we loaded the trains. I had ignored her pleas, following orders with mechanical precision. But this wasn't just watching a memory unfold. Somehow, impossibly, I was experiencing the event from Miriam's perspective. I felt her terror as the soldiers, including myself, approached her family. I felt the desperate love she had for her child, the overwhelming need to protect him that consumed every thought. I experienced her confusion as we divided families seemingly at random, her growing horror as she realized what was happening. The most devastating part was feeling her final moments of hope, the way she kept believing that somehow this was all a mistake, that someone would realize the error and reunite her with her son. Even as the train doors closed and I watched my younger self walk away without a backward glance, I felt her clinging to the impossible belief that this separation was temporary. Then I was David Goldberg, an elderly man I had helped load onto a transport truck during a roundup in occupied Ukraine. Through his eyes, I experienced the profound dignity with which he faced his fate, the way he tried to comfort younger prisoners, even as his own heart broke. I felt his confusion at how human beings could treat other human beings with such casual cruelty. I experienced his faith wavering as he wondered how God could allow such things to happen to his chosen people. Face after face appeared in that darkness, each one forcing me to experience their perspective, their pain, their final thoughts. I was not just watching their suffering, I was living it, feeling every moment of terror, confusion, and heartbreak that my actions had caused. A 10-year-old girl who died calling for her mother. A young father who worried about who would care for his family. an elderly woman who prayed for her grandchildren even as her own life ended. The weight of this experience was crushing beyond description. Each new perspective added another layer to my understanding of the devastation I had helped create. These were not the faceless enemies I had been taught to see during the war. These were human beings with hopes, dreams, fears, and families. They were people whose lives had been just as real and valuable as my own, and I had helped destroy them all. I tried to scream into that darkness, but no sound emerged. I wanted to disappear, to cease existing entirely rather than face the full magnitude of what I had done. The guilt was not just emotional, it was physical, pressing down on me like a mountain. Every breath felt impossible, every thought brought fresh waves of agonizing remorse. I deserve hell, I called out to the void, though I still had no voice with which to speak. Send me there. Let me burn for what I've done. The darkness seemed to respond to my words, growing deeper and colder. I began to feel myself sinking, or perhaps falling, into what felt like an endless abyss. The faces of my victims faded, but their pain remained, absorbed into my consciousness like poison seeping into water. This was justice, I realized. This was what I deserved for my crimes, to experience every moment of suffering I had caused, to understand the full weight of the evil I had participated in. The physical beating I had received in the camp was nothing compared to this spiritual torment that had been swift and finite. This felt eternal and ever expanding. I sank deeper into that darkness, feeling the last traces of light disappear above me. The void seemed infinite, and I began to understand that this might be my existence for eternity, alone with the pain I had caused, drowning in the accumulated suffering of my victims. It seemed fitting somehow, the perfect punishment for someone who had shown such callous disregard for human life. Imagine carrying the weight of every person you've ever hurt, feeling not just the memory of your actions, but the actual lived experience of your victim's pain. Imagine understanding with perfect clarity exactly how much suffering your choices have created in the world. That weight was crushing me, pulling me deeper into an abyss that seemed to have no bottom. I had thought the worst part of my existence was the guilt I carried during those 2 years after the war. But that guilt was nothing compared to this complete, overwhelming understanding of the reality of what I had done. In life, I had been able to rationalize, to minimize, to find ways to live with my choices. Here in this darkness, there was no escape from truth, no way to soften the edges of reality. This was hell, I realized, and I was exactly where I belonged. In that absolute darkness, crushed under the weight of every life I had helped destroy, I felt myself sinking deeper into what I was certain would be my eternal punishment. The abyss seemed infinite, and I had resigned myself to falling through it forever. But then, impossibly, in that place where no light should have been able to penetrate, a pinprick of illumination appeared. It started as nothing more than a distant star, so small I thought perhaps my tormented mind was creating illusions to ease its suffering. But as I watched, transfixed, the light grew steadily brighter and began moving toward me. This was not the harsh, blinding light you might expect from divine revelation. Instead, it was gentle, warm, like the softest glow of candles in a darkened room. As it approached, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Peace. The light continued to grow, and within it I began to make out a figure. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as he drew closer, I could see his face more clearly. I knew immediately who he was, not from church paintings or stained glass windows, but from something deeper, more fundamental. This was Jesus Christ, but not the sanitized version I had seen depicted in religious art. This was a man who carried the weight of all human suffering in his eyes. His face showed such profound sadness that I felt my consciousness recoil. But beneath that sadness was something even more powerful, infinite compassion. His eyes held depths I could not fathom, as if they had witnessed every cruelty ever inflicted and every tear ever shed. Yet when he looked at me, I saw no condemnation, no anger, only a love so pure it was almost unbearable. He approached slowly, and I felt waves of warmth radiating from his presence. The oppressive darkness that had been crushing me began to recede, though it did not disappear entirely. He did not speak with audible words, but I heard him as clearly as if he were standing beside me in the physical world. "Klaus, my son." His voice resonated through my entire being. "Why do you carry this burden alone?" I tried to back away from him, overwhelmed by the contrast between his purity and my corruption. "Lord, you don't understand what I have done," I responded, though I still possessed no physical voice. "I am not worthy to be in your presence. I have committed unforgivable sins. Tell me," he said simply, and in those two words was an invitation unlike any I had ever received. There was no judgment in his tone, only genuine desire to listen and understand. Then everything poured out of me like water bursting through a broken dam. I told him about every order I had followed, every family I had helped destroy, every child I had failed to protect. I confessed my willing participation in the machinery of genocide, my gradual dehumanization of innocent people, my cowardice in the face of evil. I described the sleepless nights filled with nightmares, the guilt that had consumed my every waking moment, the hatred I felt for the monster I had become. As I spoke, I watched tears begin to stream down his face. These were not tears of disappointment or disgust, but tears of pure sorrow for the pain that had been caused and the pain that I carried. He listened without interruption, letting me pour out years of accumulated guilt and shame. When I finally finished, exhausted by the effort of confession, he remained silent for a long moment. "I was there, Klaus," he finally said, and his words sent shock waves through my consciousness. "In every moment of suffering you describe, I was present." Suddenly, he began showing me scenes I had never witnessed, visions that revealed the true scope of what had happened during those dark years. I saw him in the ghettos, holding dying children in his arms. I saw him in the camps, comforting prisoners in their final moments. I saw him weeping over mass graves, feeling every death as if it were his own. "I felt every blow you struck," he continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "Every tear you caused, every family you separated. I experienced it all." But then his expression changed, and I saw something that shook me to my core. "But Klaus," he said, "I also felt every moment of your guilt, every sleepless night you spent in torment. I wept for your victims, yes, but I also wept for you." I could not comprehend what I was hearing. "How can you weep for someone like me? I chose to participate in evil. I could have refused, could have found another way." "Yes," he acknowledged, "you made terrible choices, but you were also a victim, Klaus. A victim of lies, manipulation, and spiritual darkness. The evil you participated in was not the full truth of who you are. He showed me more visions than scenes from my childhood that I had almost forgotten. I saw myself as a young boy, naturally compassionate, helping injured animals, sharing my food with children who had less. I saw the gradual corruption of that innocent spirit, the slow poisoning of my mind with hatred and lies. This is who you truly are, he said, pointing to that innocent child. The man you became was a distortion, a perversion of your true nature, created by forces beyond your complete understanding. I fell to my knees in that impossible space, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his compassion. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Lord. I don't deserve anything but punishment. Forgiveness is not about what you deserve, Klaus, he replied gently. It is about what I choose to give freely. Do you want to be free? Truly free from this burden you carry? The question hung in the space between us, and I realized this was the most important moment of my existence. Everything hinged on my response. I thought about the weight I had carried for years, the crushing guilt that had made every breath a struggle. I thought about the faces of my victims, forever etched in my memory. I thought about the possibility of peace, of being clean again. Yes, Lord, I whispered, my consciousness trembling with the enormity of the moment. But how can I live with what I have done? How can I face another day, knowing the pain I have caused? His response would change everything. By living for others, Klaus. By serving those you have wronged. By spending whatever time you have left making amends. Not to earn forgiveness, but because you have been forgiven. I will be with you in every act of service, every moment of love you show to those who suffer. So, I am asking you just as a grandfather would ask his beloved grandchild, when offered unlimited forgiveness for your worst failures, when presented with the possibility of complete redemption, despite your unworthiness, what would you choose? Would you have the courage to accept such an impossible gift, knowing it would require you to live the rest of your life in service to others? The choice was mine, and everything eternal hung in the balance. He moved toward me then, and I watched as he raised his hand toward my forehead. In that gesture I saw the nail marks in his palm, the scars that marked his own suffering. Those wounds seemed to glow with their own light, and I understood that his pain and sacrifice were somehow connected to this moment, to my redemption. You will return, Klaus, he said, his voice carrying the authority of creation itself. Spend your remaining years making amends, not to earn what I have already given you, but because you have been transformed by receiving it. Show the world what true repentance looks like. As his hand touched my forehead, I felt something extraordinary happening. Light began pouring through me, not from outside but from within, as if every cell of my being was suddenly illuminated. This was not painful or overwhelming. Instead, it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering in foreign lands. The light was warm, cleansing, transformative in ways that transcended physical sensation. Every stain on my soul, every mark of guilt and shame that had accumulated over years of torment began dissolving under this divine radiance. I felt layers of spiritual darkness being stripped away, revealing something underneath that I had forgotten existed. The person I was meant to be. The crushing weight that had defined my existence for so long simply evaporated, leaving me lighter than I could have imagined possible. I will be with you in every act of service, he continued, his hand still resting on my forehead. In every moment of love you show to those who suffer, in every tear of repentance, in every gesture of kindness. You will never walk alone again. Klaus, remember this promise when the path becomes difficult, when people reject your attempts at reconciliation, when the old guilt threatens to return. The cleansing continued, and I began to understand that this was not simply the removal of guilt, but an actual transformation of my fundamental nature. The capacity for cruelty that had defined my war years was being replaced by something else, an overwhelming desire to serve, to heal, to make amends for the damage I had caused. I could feel compassion flowing through me, like water through parched earth, and I knew this feeling would guide my every action for whatever time I had left. Remember this moment when the path becomes difficult, he repeated, and I felt the truth of those words settling into my consciousness. There will be times when those you seek to help will reject you, when the families of your victims will turn away, in anger and disgust. There will be moments when you question whether your efforts matter, forgetting whether genuine repentance is possible for someone like you. In those dark hours, remember standing here with me. Remember that you are loved beyond all understanding. I wanted to stay in that place forever, basking in the light of his presence, free from the burden that had defined my existence for so long. But even as that thought formed, I felt myself beginning to change, to become less solid, as if I were preparing for some kind of journey. Will I see you again, Lord? I asked, suddenly afraid of losing this connection that had given my existence meaning. You will see me in every person you serve, he replied, in every survivor who finds healing through your actions, in every child who benefits from your repentance, in every moment of genuine love you offer to a broken world. I am not leaving you, Klaus. I am sending you to be my hands and feet in a world that desperately needs healing. The light around him began to grow brighter, more intense, until it seemed to consume everything around us. But rather than being blinding, this radiance felt like coming alive. For the first time, I could feel myself being drawn back toward the physical realm, pulled away from this place of perfect understanding and love. Go now, he said, his voice beginning to fade as the light intensified. Live as a man transformed. Show them what my grace can accomplish in the most broken of lives. Then the light exploded outward, consuming my consciousness entirely, and I felt myself being hurled through space and time with tremendous force. The sensation was like being thrown back into my body from an impossible height, but without the terror such an experience should have caused. Instead, I felt anticipation, purpose, an eager desire to begin the work that lay ahead. The impact was sudden and jarring. One moment I was surrounded by divine light. The next I was gasping for air, my eyes flying open to stare at a ceiling I had never seen before. Machines around me began beeping frantically, and I could hear footsteps running toward my bed. A doctor appeared in my field of vision, his face showing the kind of shock that medical professionals are trained never to display. This is impossible, he muttered, checking instruments and taking my pulse. You were dead for 12 minutes. No heartbeat, no brain activity, nothing. And now your vital signs are completely normal. I tried to sit up and was amazed to discover that I could. The crushing pain that had consumed my final moments in the camp was completely gone. My broken ribs, which should have made breathing agony, caused no discomfort at all. I raised my left arm, the one that had been twisted at such a grotesque angle, and found it moved normally, without pain. The doctor stared at my arm in disbelief, then looked at my medical chart, then back at my arm again. The x-rays clearly show multiple fractures, he said, more to himself than to me. This shouldn't be possible. Bones don't heal in 12 minutes. But the physical changes, miraculous as they were, paled in comparison to what had happened inside me. The crushing weight of guilt that had defined my existence was gone, replaced by something I had never experienced before. Peace. Real, genuine, soul-deep peace. For the first time in years, I could breathe freely, think clearly, exist without the constant torture of remembered atrocities. Through the hospital room window, I could see some of my attackers being held back by police officers. They were staring at me with a mixture of confusion and anger, unable to understand how the man they had beaten to death was now sitting up in bed, apparently unharmed. Among them, I could see Sarah, the woman who had first recognized me, who had initiated the confrontation that led to my death. Looking at her now, I felt something that shocked me with its intensity. Love. Not romantic love, but the deep, abiding love that one human being can feel for another who has suffered greatly. I understood her rage, her need for justice, her desire to make someone pay for what had been taken from her, and I loved her for the strength it had taken to survive when so many others had not. I spoke to the police officer nearest my bed, my voice surprisingly strong for someone who had just returned from the dead. I will not be pressing charges, I said. These people did nothing wrong. They were seeking justice for crimes I actually committed. Then I looked directly at Sarah through the window, and our eyes met. Something passed between us in that moment, some recognition that went beyond words. I saw her confusion, her struggle to understand what had happened to the man she remembered as a monster, and I hoped she could see in my eyes that whoever I had been during the war, I was no longer that person. Ask yourself this question. If you experience such complete forgiveness, such total transformation of your fundamental nature, how would it change you? Would you have the courage to face those you had wronged and seek to make amends, knowing that many would never forgive you, never accept your attempts at reconciliation? Would you be willing to spend the rest of your life proving that genuine repentance was possible, even for someone who had participated in the worst evil humanity could imagine? I knew, sitting in that hospital bed, that my real life was just beginning. The moment I was released from the hospital, I knew my purpose with absolute clarity. I had to find the families I had wronged and attempt to make amends, not to ease any remaining guilt, for that had been washed away completely, but to honor the memory of those I had helped destroy, and to prove that genuine transformation was possible even for someone like me. My first step was to track down survivors and families connected to my unit's actions during the war. Here, I spent every mark I had saved on train tickets and documentation, traveling to displaced persons camps across Germany and Austria. I carried with me a small notebook where I had written down every name I could remember, every face that had appeared to me during my near-death experience. The list was heartbreakingly long. Many doors were slammed in my face, and rightfully so. I remember standing outside a small apartment in Munich, where a survivor named Jakob Weiss lived with his daughter. When he opened the door and recognized me, he stepped back as if I had struck him. His daughter, perhaps 20 years old, moved protectively in front of her father. You, Jakob whispered, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. You were there when they took my wife and son. I stood in his doorway, making no move to enter, keeping my hands visible and my voice gentle. Yes, I was there. I helped separate your family. I followed orders that destroyed your life, and I have come to tell you how deeply sorry I am for what I did to you. His daughter stepped forward. Sorry? You think sorry fixes anything? You think your words bring back my mother and brother? No, I replied honestly. Nothing I can say or do will bring them back. Nothing can undo the evil I participated in. I am here because I have been changed, transformed in ways I cannot fully explain, and I want to spend whatever life I have left serving those I wronged. Jakob studied my faith for a long time, perhaps looking for the monster he remembered from the war. Finally, he spoke. Get away from here. If I see you again, I will call the police. I left immediately, but not before placing an envelope under his door, containing half of my monthly pension and a letter explaining how he could contact me if he ever needed help. Many encounters went exactly like this. People who had suffered unimaginable loss had no interest in my transformation, no patience for my apologies. I understood their rejection completely and bore them no ill will for it. But Sarah Goldstein was different. 3 weeks after my resurrection, she appeared at the boarding house where I was staying. The landlady called up to my room to say there was a woman asking for me, and when I came downstairs, there she was, standing in the small lobby, with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I need to understand what happened, she said without preamble. The man I knew from Krakow would never have refused to press charges. That man felt nothing for the people he helped destroy. But when I looked into your eyes, at the hospital, I saw something different. We walked to a small cafe nearby, and I told her everything. I described my encounter with Christ, the overwhelming forgiveness I had received, the commission to spend my remaining years in service to those I had wronged. She listened without interruption, her face showing a mixture of skepticism and growing wonder. I lost my children, David and Rachel, she said when I finished. You put them on a train and I never saw them again. How do I reconcile your story of divine forgiveness with the fact that they died because of choices you made? You don't have to reconcile anything, I replied. My forgiveness doesn't diminish the reality of what I did or the magnitude of your loss. It simply means I have been given the opportunity to live differently, to serve rather than destroy. That conversation lasted 4 hours, and by the end, something remarkable had happened. Zara agreed to let me help her in any way I could. She was struggling to rebuild her life, working long hours in a textile factory for barely enough money to survive. I began bringing her groceries, helping with household repairs, and gradually, impossibly, we developed what could only be called a friendship. Through Sarah, I met other survivors who were willing to listen to my story. Not all of them accepted my transformation as genuine, but some did. Mrs. Rosa Feldman, whose husband had died in my unit's custody, allowed me to help her immigrate to America. David Stern, who had lost 3 brothers, let me assist him in starting a small business. This relationship developed slowly, carefully, built on consistent action rather than promises. I donated my entire pension to Holocaust memorial funds and survivor assistance programs. Every mark I earned through odd jobs went to help refugees or to support organizations working to reunite families separated by the war. I lived in the smallest, cheapest rooms I could find, eating simple meals, owning nothing beyond the most basic necessities. My life belonged entirely to this mission of service. For 30 years, I dedicated every breath to this work. I learned Hebrew prayers and began attending synagogue services when survivors invited me. I studied Jewish history and culture, trying to understand the richness of what had been lost. I spoke at schools across Germany, telling young people about the seductive power of hatred and the terrible places it could lead. The work was not easy. Some survivors remained rightfully suspicious of my motives. Others questioned whether my transformation was genuine or simply an elaborate attempt to ease my conscience. There were days when the old despair threatened to return, when the magnitude of what had been lost seemed to overwhelm any good I might accomplish. But in those dark moments I remembered his promise. I will be with you in every act of service. And I found him there, in Sarah's kitchen as I helped her prepare dinner, in the eyes of a child whose family I had helped reunite, in the tears of an elderly man, sharing memories of loved ones lost. Christ was present in every moment of genuine service, every gesture of love offered to a wounded world. I never married, never had children of my own. How could I create new life when I had helped destroy so much? My life belonged to this mission, to proving that even the most broken people could be transformed by divine grace. Every relationship I formed was in service to that purpose, every friendship a testament to the power of genuine repentance. Personal sacrifices came with this path. I faced constant reminders of my past, people who recognized me and responded with anger or disgust. Some survivors I tried to help rejected my assistance violently. I received death threats, was beaten twice by relatives of victims, and lived with the constant knowledge that many people would never forgive me, never accept my transformation as real. But I also experienced profound joy in this work. I saw families reunited, survivors find healing. Young people choose love over hatred. I watched Sarah rebuild her life, eventually remarrying and finding happiness again. I helped establish 3 memorial gardens and contributed to the documentation of survivor testimonies that would preserve their stories for future generations. Every morning for 30 years, I began my day the same way, with prayer for strength to serve and thanksgiving for the grace that had transformed my life. Every evening, I ended with gratitude for another day, to make amends and a request for guidance in the work still ahead. Now I am 83 years old, and the doctors tell me I have days, maybe weeks remaining. My body is finally failing, but my spirit has never been more at peace. I am not afraid to die because I know what waits for me. That light, that love I experienced during my near-death encounter, it remains as real and present as my own heartbeat. What did I learn from 30 years of living as a transformed man? First, that no one is beyond redemption, but redemption always comes with the responsibility to live differently. Second, that forgiveness does not erase consequences or minimize the reality of harm caused. Third, that true repentance is demonstrated through consistent action over time, not through words or promises. I learned that healing is possible even from the deepest wounds, both for those who cause harm and those who suffer it. I discovered that love is more powerful than hatred, that grace can transform even the most hardened heart, and that it is never too late to choose a different path. So I am asking you one final time, What will you do with the life you have been given? Do not wait for a near-death experience to examine your heart and choose love over hatred. Look around you right now at this very moment. Every person you see needs compassion, understanding, and grace. Every interaction is an opportunity to choose healing over harm, love over indifference. Every act of kindness, every moment of forgiveness, every gesture of service to those who suffer is Christ working through you, whether you recognize Him or not. The choice between love and hatred, between service and selfishness, between healing and harm, is placed before each of us every single day. I was a Nazi soldier who met Jesus Christ and learned that divine love can transform even the most corrupted heart. But that love comes with a commission to spend your life proving that transformation is real through consistent, sacrificial service to others. Choose love. Choose forgiveness. Choose to see the divine spark in every human being you encounter. It is never too late to begin again. Never too late to choose a different path. Lord Jesus Christ, receive my spirit. My work here is done, but the invitation to transformation remains open to everyone who hears the story. May they choose better than I did during those dark years. May they choose love.